I want to make a video about feeding, and every beekeeper does have to feed their bees at some point, but it's just been my observation over time that feeding outside of the hive, it ends up causing more harm than good in your apiary. It just creates a lot of robbing and competition. And so while we're watching, these bees, this is an entrance feeder, and so it's a very restricted flow. There's just a few pinholes in the top of that lid, and so this is nothing near the level of competition that would be created by an open feeding, like a 5-gallon pail or something like that. And it's just been my experience. I've seen hundreds and hundreds of dead bees from open feeding situations. The other thing that I noticed, and the reason I'm making this today, is I put these entrance feeders on hives, and in 2 days they'll have drained them completely. It's just a quart of syrup, some even in a day. Here, with this open feeding, it's taken over 5 days for this to drain. There's just so much fighting and competition going on. It really restricts the flow. The other thing I see, you'll see a lot of bees that are very dark, and they look kind of wet. They are not. What has happened is, in the competition back in there, all of the hairs on the top of their thorax are being ripped off. So that's why they look extra dark, is they're just they've been physically altered. Like those two on the corner there, one is very dark, the other still has the hairs on its thorax. And so it feels very unnatural and kind of wrong to me, like just not very efficient. So I understand sometimes it's efficiency for the beekeeper, but I think feeding internally or entrance feeding, that's what I prefer now, is just the way to go to manage the robbing. Because bees, like any living organism, they get habits and patterns, and so if your colony gets accustomed to high competition and robbing and things like that, it just influences the whole apiary. It changes the entire environment changes. So you don't really want to condition your bees to have this robbing pulse. It's only detrimental. So anyway, let me show you guys what has kind of been my system that I'm shifting towards. Before we go over to the feeder, I wanted to show you this random experiment. It's basically I had made these pollen patties a little thin, and so instead, I also ran out of time, but they didn't go into the hives, and instead I just threw them down here to see what would happen. And the feeding on them has been really interesting with how calm it is. A lot less competition, there's less death surrounding it, and I think that's really interesting and cool. This is not going back to the colony. That's probably the main reason. This is just feeding some old field bees, probably on their way out anyway. And just thought it was interesting that little bit of mixing it with something dry, at a certain point it kind of slows down maybe their uptake or their transport of it. But it seems like the bees here are just kind of going slow and maybe hanging out, spending the rest of their days. Anyway, it's been out here too long, so I'm gonna take it away at the end of today. Don't want them to get sick or anything, but it's just been interesting to see how they do go after it. All right, on to the feeder. So this is the feeding system that I'm moving towards in the moment, or what I'm utilizing in the moment, and it's an entrance feeder with the making sure that the feeder is as far from the entrance as possible. So you see they're opposite. That's really important to manage the robbing. You don't want to keep your entrance against your feeder. That's just a recipe for negative robbing. And then a simple yogurt cup. If you use a pint or even a quart mason jar for your entrance feeder, a yogurt cup works as a really great rain barrier, because a big part of these is that they do bring moisture into the hive potentially. But what I found is that the bees can seal this reasonably well, and then it's not much different than a rain, because this catches and this all falls past the feeder, so you get less water going through at the cap level. So I still do use frame feeders sometimes, but I've just seen that there's a lot of spaces to protect and guard. It creates this opportunity for beetles to come into the colony, and it also, the bees often build comb in the gap in between, or you're having to take it in and out, and then you're just managing the bees where you don't really want to be moving things around too much, unless it's a permanent frame feeder that the bees are really used to. It doesn't work in my system. So the other thing, this is a much smaller pulse. See, a frame feeder is going to take a whole gallon. This is forcing me to refill it more slowly, or give it kind of a slower pulse. If I really wanted to build them fast, then I would go with a frame feeder, because I can deliver the syrup much more quickly and get a queen laying or something like that. And I actually have no experience with the top feeders where you're putting a whole new box on. I just haven't invested in them because they do cost money, and these were cheaper to start. So that's where I'm at as far as feeding colonies. This is a better example of where the yogurt cup really finishes the job. So this is with the standard mason jar, the 16 ounce, and this is, I mean, they finished it, it's empty, but here it's got a little bit of a tilt and it's covering the whole thing, and so it's really keeping the water from going into the hive a lot better than it does with the first one you saw was a quart. So it's a little bit close to the entrance here, but that's because that's where their entrance was, and I didn't really want to change it up too much. But what I think this system really does, the big benefit, is it allows the feeding to have that sort of flexibility, but it also can be a permanent fixture. So from here on out, I can design this to just stay. I think this could stay year-round with very minimal impact, and then when the time comes, I can give them some sugar water and not really see a lot of disruption to any of the flow or anything like that. So anyway, I'm still actually really pretty new to beekeeping, like 5 years just now, but still learning all the time. So, go and check out the forums on BeeSource and do your own research, but I just thought I would share. All right, you guys, take care.